Well, I first became involved in biodiversity issues at a political level, if you like, in the 1980s, early 1980s. And at that time I was working in the Australian government, for the Australian government.
1980 seems to have been quite a special decade when you had a Republican president and a Conservative British Prime Minister, among many others, coming together to say we have some critical issues we need to discuss. What for you are your memories of that particular decade leading up to the Rio Earth Summit in '92?
I think that decade was seen perhaps as a decade when there was more opportunity to do things. People don't remember perhaps Mrs. Thatcher for the fact that she was one of the key politicians in the world who identified climate change as an issue that really had to be addressed. And in a sense that was an opportunity that was lost. So I think there was some gold moments, if you like, in the 80s, but they in a sense also dissolved away.
And how much of a breakthrough was it that these three Rio Conventions, desertification, climate change and biodiversity, where we are today, how much of a breakthrough was it that they were established?
It was an enormous breakthrough, just as the idea of biodiversity, the concept of biodiversity and the word biodiversity came about in the late 1980s. And for it to have gone from a new word in the English lexicon and a new concept scientifically to a convention in 6 years is totally remarkable. Climate change was on the agenda from the International Panel for Climate Change, and the whole issue of desertification and land degradation was also very clearly there. So that moment in Rio 92, alas, was not repeated 20 years later in Rio this year, when in fact very little new happened at all. And I think the momentum of the three conventions being established was something that we haven't seen before, and unfortunately we haven't seen since.
What do you put that loss of momentum down to, and can you pinpoint a time in the mid-90s or maybe the start of this particular millennia where you felt the issue had slowed down or was being, I don't know, lost from the public consciousness?
I think a lot of progress happened in the 90s, and as someone who was involved in the very early years of this convention, the Biodiversity Convention, a lot of things happened, a lot of issues were tackled, a lot of discussions took place, very good discussions, very freewheeling discussions. But by the end of the 90s decade and the start of this century, there seemed to be a lack of energy, and frankly, this century has not been a great century to start off with. And I think that has actually affected, those feelings have actually affected how international negotiations have moved. They've become, in a sense, rather more formalized, rather more structured, rather more staid, and rather less effective.
What do you put that lack of energy down to? Because someone like me who's just recently come into this arena, it strikes me there's an immense amount of information and also some really strong alarm bells that are going off about world population, about declining species, ocean acidification. What do you put that lack of energy down? Why are those alarm bells, if you like, not being heard by the people who need to hear them?
Well, this is a personal view, but I really do think that actually there's so much information overload, and in a sense almost a desperation by politicians globally, that how on earth are we going to deal with all these issues? How are we going to solve these questions? And in a sense, masterly inaction seems to have taken over, and that's a great pity, because we do have the information. We know what the solutions are for many of these key issues. The problem is putting them into practice. That's certainly true in the Biodiversity Convention, where so many guidelines have been passed on so many key issues, and yet where they need to be applied, which is at the national level, they haven't been. And that's why the new Executive Secretary, Braulio, is talking about implementation being the key. It's totally correct, but it can only happen if the countries who are parties to the convention actually get on and implement. And that's different from climate change, where the issue is a global one, where the world needs to come together, and the world doesn't seem to be able to come together. It's as if well, I use the rabbit in the headlights of a car, because I think that's exactly what you're seeing.
Is it fair to say that almost someone referred to it to me as the sins of its birth, the fact that we had common but differentiated responsibility written into text at an early stage, and that we had this north-south global divide, albeit not completely geographical. Is it fair to say that those, while they made sense in '92, are actually stopping any progress now?
Yes, I think there are some terms, there are some words, and there are some ideas that perhaps were not helpful in hindsight. And it's clear that only global action can solve the key problems. But it was interesting in a sense that the shock of not achieving the targets which were set in 2002 by the CBD, that really led to an energized approach to the new set of targets for 2020. And clearly some of those will not be achieved because some of them are actually too ambitious. But again, I think people misunderstood the idea of a target. A target is something you're trying to get to. It's not something you will necessarily get to. And the sense of profound disappointment and if you like, well, yes, disappointment generally that we didn't get there has kind of pervaded the discussions, whereas in fact we made a lot of progress, but we didn't hit those targets. Whether we will hit the new targets or not, we'll see in 2020. But there's a lot more energy now at the start of this decade about how we can measure getting to those targets and the efforts that we're going to have to put in to reach them. So I think I'm actually quietly hopeful. What I feel is the least helpful thing is where we are still talking too much about, we're using the P word, what I call the P words, protect and preserve. These are things we cannot do. We must conserve, sustainably use, and share the benefits of biodiversity. And if we do that in a sensible way globally together, then we can actually achieve the targets and we can actually achieve the objectives of the CBD. But if we still hand-wring and say we want to go back to what it was like in the 1890s, we will fail utterly. We have to recognize the new realities. And some of those new realities are not pleasant.
Is that attitude about taking us back, is that particularly prevalent in the CBD arena, where we have these strong emphasis on biodiversity and ensuring that the water is clean and the earth we live in isn't sort of made toxic by the heavy industry?
I think it's more evident in the CBD than perhaps in climate change, where the whole thing is about change. CBD is also about change. We talk about, a lot is made about biodiversity loss, and it's true, there is loss, but loss is part of change. And if we put the emphasis on biodiversity change in the CBD, I think also we'd make a lot more progress. And the NGOs are actually in quite different camps, if you like, in the CBD, where some are really conservative, and they're mainly from developed countries who want to go almost back to Arcadia, and others from developing countries are saying, look, please help us manage our new situations. How can we get better equality for women? How can we get food in people's tables? And all of that is part of biodiversity. So solving that global equation is something that's really important.
Do processes where one small country can effectively veto what, I don't know, 191 or 194 other countries want to do they work? They seem good on paper, but are they really practical?
Consensus is an issue. You reach the lowest common denominator. At one stage in my career, I was chair of the International Whaling Commission, and whatever people say about that, because we voted on every single issue, we always got a result. It may not be what people wanted, but we knew where we were. In the case of CBD, in the case of other conventions now, the modern approach is let's get consensus. But as you say, to try and do that for 193 or so countries is actually really difficult. And I think some countries hanging on in the hope that somehow they'll get their particular word in a document is not the way to advance the issues. And again, you know, the implementation has to take place in those very countries. It's not going to take place in the convention, which is not an ethereal body at all.
Fascinating talking to you. One last question, then let's sort of end on a kind of positive note. What are the key achievements of the CBD, and what gives you hope moving forward?
I think the key achievement in the CBD is recognizing that we can actually share biodiversity, we can sustainably use it, and we can conserve it, and we can do all of those things together. That's come through, and my hope and my feeling of hope, I guess, is that countries will do that nationally. They now have the tools from the CBD, and we should spend probably less time in the CBD meetings and more time actually doing stuff on the ground.